In this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at global variables, but if you don't already know what a variable is, let's talk about it for a second. Imagine a variable like a folder that you physically have, where you can only put one thing into that folder, and that thing is data. It's either going to be an integer, a string, a boolean, or a float value. Those are the most common in other programming languages. In Construct 2, we get two types that we can add. We can either add in a number or a text, so an integer or a string. And that's how you define and get a return value from a variable. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. You'll see it in a second as we actually make a global variable. But what is a global variable, and why do I think that this is going to be the first thing that really makes sense to you if you've never programmed before? A global variable in Construct 2 specifically is accessible through every event sheet and every layout, in between both event sheets and layouts. It is universally accepted. So you define it once somewhere, and then every other event sheet in the project can access it. And that's really the important concept, and why I think it's the first thing you'll be able to understand, because you'll initially just start putting everything into global variables because you have access to it on every layout, and there's no scope into this, and there's no understanding of how this is supposed to get more complex. It's just you have a bunch of global variables that are accessible throughout your entire game. So there's definitely some downsides to global variables, but let's start by creating a global variable. You're going to see here that I have a layout 1 with its normal event sheet 1, just like making a new project. And then you see all I did was right click and add a new event sheet and called it globals in all caps, just so I really knew which event sheet hosted all of my global variables. I recommend doing it this way in Construct 2 because otherwise it's going to get cluttered. All global variables will automatically add to the top, even though you can move them around. It'll always be at the top of your event sheet, so I think it's just better to have them on their separate event sheet because, again, they are accessible throughout the entire project once you add them just once. So let's add our first global variable, and let's call this score. So we're gonna make the name of this score. The type of this, as we already decided, is going to be a number because it's a score. It's going to hold 15 as the initial value, and then we're going to give it a description of this is our game's score. The description is just kind of an optional thing that you can add in case you send your project to somebody and want them to understand what your code is without adding in another comment to add up space to increase your game space there. So completely optional. I usually don't do it, but I should be doing it more often just to really understand what my code does. But here's the thing. You have now defined the global number score to equal 15. And we are going to be changing that number. We're going to be incrementing that as we go. Now, in all of my tutorials and all of my courses, I use global variables a lot, and I think that there's kind of a dependency on them that shouldn't be on them because they are not something you want to depend on when you have multiple instances relying on them. You want their own instance variables to take care of that. We'll get into that when we talk about instance variables, but what I'm saying is these are good for one-time values and mostly that, and you should leave it as that. A score is actually a good example of a global variable because you can actually control it that way, but really you'd be storing it in something like local storage later on to actually save to your device, whether it's the internet or your phone or whatever it is. So just keep in mind that pretty much 95% of all your variables can mostly be an instance variable and will actually serve you better because it's more modular and it gives every single object the option to have different values. So I know that probably doesn't make sense right now, but just know that going forward, when you're programming, you want to say to yourself, and as you learn local variables and instance variables, which does this really belong in? Which is this appropriate? For right now, we're learning about global variables. So let's look at layout 1. And let's drag in our text object. If I don't have one, I do. And I already called it score text. So you probably have a text object in your object types folder from the retro style project. So let's actually just drag this in. And I gave the object name score text. I need to say object score text, just like that. So now we have our object name. And you can see here that I can change the text property just like this. I could say, this is my score. And now the text equals this is my score. But if I want this to change every time I have, a new score, if I want this to add 1 every single time my score goes up, I need to use a variable. And typically I would use a global variable for something like this. Any HUD display, I probably would use a global variable to store it. So what we're going to do to actually display that score equals 15 is we need to actually set this every single frame per second that our game is running. So let's go into event sheet 1. And let's add the event, and let's say this. So we haven't actually gone over the system at all, and we've used as examples the keyboard and whatnot. So all of these are just objects in our project that we can actually modify their events and actions. Whereas our system gives us a way to kind of compare and do other additional loops and triggers that we didn't actually have given to us first. So this will start to make sense as we do this more. But for example, we have a start of layout. Now that's only found under the system. And on the start of our layout, that's going to be triggered whenever we load layout 1. If we have another layout, then that's not going to be triggered on layout 2. It's only going to be triggered on layout 1. So we have these certain system events that are really, really handy. And the one that we're going to use now is every tick. And if you can't find it at all, just type in every, or start to type in every, and then it'll pop up under general. So every tick, what that means is this is going to be running every frame per second that this event sheet is active. Every time we have layout 1 open and it's calling this event sheet, so you can see right here, it's using event sheet 1, this is going to be running 60 frames a second, which is the usual amount of frames per second that your game will be running at. So every single frame, we want it to be updating and checking to see what this global variable equals. Has this changed? Has this gone up? Has this gone down? Is it still at 15? What does this equal? And that's how we can really add this in. So let's say every tick, let's set the text. So we're going into our text object, and instead of looking around through all this, I'm just going to type in set text. And now I'm going to put it to something else. Now we've already done it as a string, and we already know that we can't increment it. We need to actually input the variable. So we called it score. So let's type in score, and you can already see that it's going to pop up, and it has the global or the globe icon next to it. So now we know that that is our global variable. That's our indicator. The rest of these are just system events. So if they have the cog next to them, these are system events that you can use as code functions, which we can get into a lot later. If you are a programmer and you've been programming for a while, these might look familiar. For example, you already have these functions like lerp right there. So that's what they are. They're just expressions, essentially. So in this case, we're just going to inject into our text object the global variable of score, which will now set it to 15. So we have it as default as 2. When I hit play here, let me make sure that this is NWJS. When I hit play, you're going to see this as 15 because it's running every single tick to set this as 15. Now, if I created something, if I go in here and I add in a keyboard press, I don't want to hold it down, I want to press. On key pressed, let's say on key S is pressed, then I want to increment my global variable. So how would I do that? Go into my system, and now I have all these options. I can set the value, I can subtract from, or I can add to. So I'm going to add 1 to the score every single time I press the S key. Now notice the global variable isn't here, it was defined over here, and that's the big takeaway. Define it once and it's accessible everywhere. So now what I can do here is I can go onto my layout 1, and now I can start hitting S, and because it's happening every single tick, you can see it starts to upgrade because it's checking to what score equals every single tick. So hopefully that's starting to make sense. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this a step further. Now, if you're new to programming, hang in there because now I'm going to take it a step further, and I do want you to pay attention to this because it may not make sense initially, this part might not make sense, but in the long run it will, and hopefully this can help you avoid any future issues or any future, I don't know. Let's see what happens. So what we're going to do is let's actually rename this so we know what this is. Let's call this our score. So now we have our text. Initially, this is just called score. This is our text value, but we know when we hit play, it's going to equal 15 because that's what we told it to. And when we hit S on the keyboard a bunch of times, it's going to increment it by 1. So here's the problem that we come up across a lot. If this acts as our HUD in a game, and if you don't know what a HUD is, it's our heads-up display. It's just a way to show you your health. It's a way to show you your score as you're going through the level. If this is going to act as that, then this is going to need to be on every single level we make. So the initial beginner thought is to do this. It's to make a new layout. We'll add an event sheet to it. And it's to go over here, and it's to copy this, and it's to paste this. And that's fine. It's going to work, but it's not correct in terms of scale. It's not correct. If you have 55 layouts, 55 levels, you're not going to want to copy and paste and copy and paste, and that doesn't help you create reusable code. There's a very important lesson in programming. It's called DRY. It's called don't repeat yourself. And that's really what Construct 2 helps you learn the most. It really helps you to consolidate your code and really figure out how not to repeat your actions and, in this case, some of your layers. So here's what we have so far. We have our background layer. So you can see that layout 0 actually has a background color and it's not transparent. If I turn this to yes, then it's actually going to display as black because there's nothing there. There's no color there. So let's actually double click that, make sure it's not transparent. Let's make a new layer by hitting the plus and let's rename this and call this score in all caps. Now, I do this in all caps to actually define a global layer. So what I'm going to do here, since this is still on layout 0, I don't know why it's called layout. I probably named that by accident. What I'm going to do on layer 0 here is I'm going to right-click on our text object, and I'm going to move it to the layer score. So now I can lock layer 0, and the only thing that's on there is the background. And that's very important when it comes to designing levels for your game, that you have a background layer, but it's more important that you just kind of separate all of your objects from the background layer for this purpose. So now we have our score text object on a completely separate layer, and we have a layout 2, and we want to be able to go here, but let's imagine that this is level 2. We want to actually bring over our score. We don't want to copy and paste it. We just want to have it automatically be there. So how do we do that? Well, just like a global variable, we can make our global layer once, and then it'll be accessible to the entire project. The only catch is you have to add it in. So instead of automatically being accessible to the entire project, you actually have to manually make it accessible, which is a great feature. It's a great thing, and here's why. Here's how we set this up, really. If we click over here, if I'm just clicking on our canvas, you can see that I have our layout 1 properties. If I click on this object, you can see I have the object properties. If I click on the layer, I'm now in the layer properties. And if you go right here to global, all I have to do is double click on this. Because it's at no, I need to turn it to yes. Now on layout 1, on this layer, that is my initial creation. This is where I've defined this layer score in all caps as a global layer. So when I want to edit it, I come back here. Just like if I want to edit this value, I'd come back here and double click on it. So it's really important that you understand that, because this is where you would edit a global layer. Usually what I do is I actually even go one step further and I put any HUD elements like this on its own layout, and I do the same thing. That way I go to that HUD layout and then I come back. And if you want to see that, I've done about 10 tutorials on that. Anyway, let's finish this up here. So what we're going to do now that this is global, all I have to do is manually add that in to this layout. So first let me fix this by making this, let's see here. I can't even tell why we don't see the color here. Transparent would be no. But for some reason it's not showing our color because this is somehow a global layer itself. So let's add in a new layer. I don't know how that got messed up. Let's delete that, and there we go. Let's add in our new layer here. Let's lock this, and just so you don't get confused here, this is our background. And if I go back to layout 1, this is our background. And I'm going to lock that as well so I don't mess with that. Let's go over here and let's unlock this, and let's rename this to score in all caps. Now watch what happens when I do that. Actually, we need to delete that. For some reason that got overridden. So right here you can see that this is not global. This is called layer 0. Let me rename this and let me put this to score in all caps, and watch what happens. When I hit enter, it automatically overrides it. And now it's actually pulling from the initial source where we've created this global layer. So now, just by adding in the name score as an uppercase, all uppercase layer, I'm now injecting whatever I have on the initial layer. So now that object is going to be carried over to layout 2. Okay, let's actually see this work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add another layer onto layout 1. And I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this button. This is optional. It doesn't have to be global. I'm going to actually double click and put in a form button. And let's just put it right here. Let's go into our event sheet 1. And let's say if we click on the button on clicked, then let's go to the system. And let's have the system go to a layout. In this case, we're going to say go to layout 2. So when we go to layout 2, we should now see this score text object appear. So let's hit play. And let's see. So it's at 15. Let's hit OK. And now it does appear. We do go to the next layout, but the 15 didn't carry over. And you might be questioning, why didn't it? Because it's a global variable. It should have gone over. Yes and no. So the reason why it didn't go over is because layout 2 uses event sheet 2, and there's nothing in event sheet 2. Even though event sheet 2 has access to the global variable, we're not telling it what to do. Now, again, the use of don't repeat yourself comes up, because the first thing you might do is say, okay, well, how did I do that in event sheet 1? How did I set that to the global variable? We set it in our every tick. So you might think, let's copy this and let's paste this. Well, will that work? Of course that will. Oops, I tried to save it. Let's go back and let's hit play. And this works, but this is repeating yourself and therefore not creating reusable code. You're not being efficient enough, and you can see nothing has changed there. So even though this works, this isn't the way you want to do it. Now, I've already covered global layers and global variables in the same tutorial here, hoping that this makes sense, hoping that globalization is really the first concept that makes sense. And hopefully, if you've never programmed in Construct 2, you're starting to follow along and understand how powerful Construct 2 can be. But this doesn't make sense. How can we reuse this appropriately? Here's what we can do. And now this is going to add in one more concept, and then we're going to be done with this. We're going to add in a new event sheet, and we're going to call this our includes. Actually, you know what? Let's come up with a better name, because this is going to be something else. Let's call this our, you know what? Let's just call it includes. That way it kind of makes sense. So in our includes, let's grab our every tick. Let's cut it out of event sheet 2, and let's paste it in here. And let's actually delete it from event sheet 1. So now nothing is going to equal score. Not on layout 1 or layout 2 will object score text equal our global variable of 15. Nothing will. So if I hit play, it's just going to say score, just like this. And if I go to the next layout, it's just going to say score. So now that we've separated this, we only have this code once. How do we include it into these event sheets? Very simply, we can right-click, include the event sheet, or we could hit N on the keyboard to bring up the window again, and we're going to bring in our includes event sheet that has the every tick. This is the way to bring in things that need to have access to other things. This is how you do it in Construct 2, and it's extremely helpful for not repeating yourself. So I can even copy this and paste this in, and now we have our include, where we're including our includes event. Let me call it the includes event so you know what we're doing here. We're including the includes event in both event sheets, in both layouts. So now when I hit play and I go over here and I hit OK, you can see that that works. Let's go to event sheet 1. What else can we include in both events? That way it's accessible to both events, because right now we can only add the score. We can only add to the score in event sheet 1 on layout 1. So let's try this out. Let's go here to event sheet 1 to layout 1. Let's hit S a bunch of times. Now the score equals 26. Let's go and hit OK. Let me hit S, and now I can't do it because that event only exists on layout 1. Let me cut this out, and actually a shortcut to doing this is I can double click on this includes, and it'll take me to that event sheet, which is pretty cool. And now I can put that in there as well, which is pretty great. So let me hit play, and there we go. When I hit S a bunch of times, it goes up. When I go to layout 2, it goes up. Now, as a challenge, I'm not going to do this because we've already gone so overboard. Hopefully this has made sense. I think this has. As a challenge, I'd like to figure out how you would program in a way to program both of this. So now we're going to layout 2 here, and the quick and easy solution is to just go to event sheet 2, paste this in, and say go back to layout 1, which honestly that works fine, and there really is nothing wrong with doing it this way. But is there a way that we can only code this once instead of having to copy and paste this? Of course there is, and that's going to be my challenge to you for this lecture here. But we need to bring over that button. So how can we do that? Well, we can go to this layer, and we can just double click on global. We can go to layout 2, and we can add that in just like this. We can just rename this and call this button. Let's hit save. Oops, I always hit save, and I haven't saved this project. So let's just hit play, and let's go here, and there you go. Now we're here. Let's go back. You can't even tell because now everything's the same, but it is going back and forth between both layouts. And actually, you know what I could do to distinct which layout is which? I can just make this a quick one. Or I probably could have used a text object. So let me do that. Let me grab this. Let me make a new text object. Let's grab text object and let's call this 1. Let's copy this. Let's go to layout 2 and on a new layer here. I don't know why that's not showing. Transparent. I don't know why that's not showing. That one's weird. We'll have to figure that out in a second. But let's change this to 2. Might be my screen recording. And let's see what happens here. So that's layout 1 and that's layout 2. And the only reason why it's not deleting 1 is because this is on a global layer. Let me get this off. Let's add this in like so. Okay, hopefully I haven't confused you too much. We definitely covered a whole lot in this. There's no doubt about that. But I hope this gives you a huge overview into global objects and global layers and just global things in Construct 2. Very powerful, very useful when it comes to not repeating yourself, but global variables do have a shortcoming when it comes to can you depend on this global variable to control all of these multiple instances of objects, and we'll get into that as we cover instance variables. Thank you for watching this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.